Well, on the domestic front, conservative Christian anti-gay activists are losing power.
Little by little.
Yep,
it seems
but
to
more
be chipping
rapidly
away.
lately than ever before.
Yeah.
But many conservative Christians are rallying the troops again and trying to mount a new offensive against gay marriage. And one of the guys that's spearheading that effort is the subject of today's podcast. This is Robert P. George.
A Catholic.
A Catholic.
One of the few Catholic apologists we've really taken on.
And a professor of jurisprudence at Princeton University.
Mm-hmm.
A recent article in the New York Times titled The Conservative Christian Big Thinker by David D. Kirkpatrick has named Robert P. George as the country's most influential conservative thinker.
Which is saying a lot because I'd never heard of the guy until now.
I had, back several years ago, regarding the stem cell research.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's
bill,
right.
You know, George Bush banning research on embryos and all these embryos basically being sent to the trash when they could have been helping researchers. Robert P. George was...
He was at the forefront of that movement.
Yeah, he really made some of the most convincing arguments on that side. But I'd barely taken note of him.
Right.
I've noticed, though, that there's an uptick in when I see debates on chat rooms or response boards in this. It was an unfamiliar strain to me. I'm used to dealing with Protestant apologists.
Right.
Or the people who just who are give religious arguments on the basis of like personal revelation or emotional arguments. But this was some of the first. I started coming across more and more Catholic types who were using a form of argument that was relatively new to me, based more on philosophy.
Yeah, and that is Robert P. George's claim to fame. He is a proponent of natural law ethics, natural law philosophy. And usually, I think when people think of natural law, if you know anything about kind of the ethical tradition there, people think of that as being somewhat of a religious thing, right? God is the author of nature. Studying the book of nature is understanding God's mind. And so he has written his moral law into the very fabric of nature itself. And so living in accord with natural law is ethical. It's one's God-given duty.
Literally.
And what people don't realize is actually that's one strain of natural law thought. That's one strain of natural law ethics. It's entirely possible to adopt that ethical perspective and have no commitment to theism whatsoever. It has a long historical tradition that precedes the Catholic Church. It goes all the way back to the Stoics in ancient Rome. It goes even further back to that. People trace natural thought thinking back to Aristotle. And modern theorists of natural law ethics insist themselves that you do not have to believe in God to accept this ethical theory.
They insist. I'm not sure I'm always buying it, but they do insist that.
Quoting the New York Times article speaking about this, in the American culture wars, George wants to redraw the lines. It is the liberals, he argues, who are slaves to a faith-based secularist orthodoxy of feminism, multiculturalism, gay liberationism, and lifestyle liberalism. Wow. Conservatives, in contrast, speak from the high ground of non-sectarian public reason.
So reason is the high ground against faith.
Yes, actually, the way they are framing it. We are the ones who have faith. And they are,
faith
this
is a bad thing. Faith
self-evident
is
reason supports their traditional view.
God.
But this is what makes Robert George so powerful and so influential, is because he doesn't have to stand up there and say, well, I believe the Bible says marriage is because a man and a woman, and everybody can just object, well, I don't accept your interpretation of the Bible.
Exactly.
I don't accept the authority of the Bible.
Yes.
And legally, that argument is pretty much worthless because it would be an establishment of religion.
Although I imagine it would actually hold up fairly well in many courts in this country.
He's not making an argument based on Scripture. He's not making an argument based on personal revelation. His argument is based on taking these things to be fundamental truths in the structure of reality.
And even biology.
He frames it as an objective argument. To quote the New York Times article again, what makes his natural law new is that it disavows dependence on divine revelation or biblical scripture, or even history and anthropology. Instead, George rests his ethics on a foundation of practical reason, and quoting George here, invoking no authority beyond the authority of reason itself.
Sounds like our kind of guy, really.
Right. That's kind of what we ask for, is we ask for people to support their claims with reason and evidence and not just with faith in Scripture. So this makes Robert George kind of a prime target for us.
Absolutely. And a worthy target.
So we're going to examine more closely his case against gay marriage.
Which is related to the other issues of stem cell and abortion and gender politics too, but it's most apparent with the gay marriage issue, because it rests on his foundation of what the purpose of marriage is.
Right. And so real briefly, before we get into this, I want to give our listeners who may not be familiar kind of an idea of how natural law ethics, how that thinking would proceed. Of course, there's all different varieties, and I can't possibly do it justice while being brief. But I think kind of the essence of natural law thought is it doesn't have to be that right and wrong is actually written in the fabric of nature somehow. It's more of the idea is that if before you understand what ethical goals are appropriate for a human being to follow or pursue, you have to know something about human nature itself. Mm-hmm. The way we are put together, composed, our nature as human beings has relevant information for our ethical goals. So a great case of this is Aristotle's ethics. Aristotle famously came up with the goal or the purpose of humankind is eudaimonia, happiness, but happiness in the sense of contentment or kind of a peace of mind, prosperity, the good life. And how Aristotle arrived at that as the end goal of human ethics is he looked at human nature and he said, why do we do the things that we do? Why do we pursue things like friends? Why do we pursue things like social prestige? Why do we pursue things like wealth? And in each of these cases, he found, we go after these goods because they help us to get or to reach some other good, which is superior, which is better. You pursue wealth because wealth can help you live a more happy and satisfied life. You look for friendship and honor from your community for the same reasons. And so he terminates at some endpoint, some value, which is good for its own sake and for no other reason. And that's kind of how natural law thinking proceeds. You try to identify a set of basic human goods, those things that we do for their own sake. They need no further justification. They are an end in of themselves, not a means to some other end. And then once you have an idea of what are those basic human goods, then you can identify instrumental goods. You can identify other actions, other goods worth pursuing that will help you to achieve that superior good, what they would call an intrinsic good. So I set that up just so you have a basic idea of where George is coming from, and this is going to come into play when we consider objections to his idea. But real quick, let's summarize George's case against gay marriage. We'll be looking at Robert P. George's argument as it's presented in What's Sex Got to Do with It? Marriage, Morality, and Rationality from the University of Notre Dame, American Journal of Jurisprudence. Okay, so here's the problem. The institution of marriage is in crisis. Just look at the high rates of divorce or all these children that are being born out of wedlock, and you get the idea. The institution of marriage is in serious trouble today. And his idea is not that gay marriage is the cause of this crisis, that it's going to somehow destroy the family. It's more of an idea that this is a symptom.
Right.
Gay marriage is a symptom of an underlying cause that is more deep and fundamental.
Just like divorce and children born out of wedlock. Yep.
What is the cause of the crisis of marriage? It is a failure of reason. It is a failure of people to really understand. As a society, we've actually lost touch with what the true value of marriage is. So quoting George,
"The thesis I set before you is that a key source of the pathologies afflicting marriage in contemporary societies is the significant erosion and, in certain circles, nearly the complete loss of a sound understanding of marriage, especially in its sexual dimension as an intrinsic rather than merely instrumental human good."
Okay, so what does he mean here by intrinsic rather than merely instrumental? What marriage is to George, he defines it as a multi-level union. He says that marriage is a multi-level sharing of life. That is, a relationship that unites the spouses at the bodily, that means biological, at the bodily, emotional, dispositional, rational, and even spiritual levels of their being. So marriage is unity. Don't get too hung up on that spiritual part. Right. Marriage is unity experienced between two people. It's the fullest kind of unity that two human beings can ever have. It operates on several different levels. That's his basic idea. And so as such, marriage then is what he would call an intrinsic good. That marital union has intrinsic value. It's one of those basic human goods that you could identify.
It's good just by being. Okay?
Right.
It's
just for its own sake.
Right.
You don't need to pursue that for any other reason. So the opposite of an intrinsic good would be what he calls an instrumental good. That is something that is valuable only as a means to some other end. And so that's key to his understanding of the problem of marriage in today's society, is that marriage is an intrinsic good. It's not an instrumental good. Mm-hmm. You know, it may have some instrumental goods attached to it. It's going to provide social benefits to the couple through tax breaks or whatever, and their marriage might help society in turn by providing a stable environment for children. Mm-hmm. But that's just a fortunate consequence.
That's not the point of it.
Right.
Yep.
That's not what it's about. It's a multi-level sharing of life, and that is valuable for its own sake. Now, why am I harping on this so much? Well, George says,
if marriage is understood, or in my view, misunderstood, as a purely instrumental good, then it is worth having and preserving precisely and only to the extent that it produces the satisfactions to which it is a means: companionship, safe and reliable sexual pleasure, social standing, heirs, or any number of other benefits.
Okay, so you're not getting along with your husband, you're not happy. Why bother trying to fix things, right? Just find somebody new. Your wife's getting old and chubby, she's not putting that same fire in your loins as she used to. Trade her in for a younger model. You know, there's no need for effort, there's no need for patience. Why bother sacrificing to keep that marriage alive? In the end, if we're just treating these as instrumental goods, it's really selfishness and convenience that wins the day.
If you're not getting the value you used to, then what's the point?
Yeah. So in his mind, when this kind of attitude is tolerated or even condoned by a society, so goes the argument, the institution of marriage will collapse. Nobody's going to fight for it anymore. And those secondary benefits to society, which really are by no means trivial, that's very important.
Of course.
Those secondary benefits to society are going to collapse with it, in his mind. So far, this seems semi-reasonable. I don't really agree with everything he's saying here, but I don't think you have to agree with every point to at least see his logic here. The question is, what does any of this have to do with gay marriage? And it really all hinges back on his definition of marriage as this multi-level sharing of life, and specifically what that entails for George. For him, it has a very strong relationship to the role of sex in marriage.
But very specific sex, too.
Yeah, a certain type of sex,
yes,
as we're going to see. So to George, sex is an essential part of marriage. Sex consummates and actualizes the marriage. By actualize, we just mean it takes this abstract concept and makes it a physical reality.
So when you're having sex, then you're really married?
Then you're experiencing that full multi-level
okay.
union. Yes,
yeah.
yes.
All right.
But it's, as you said, it's not just any kind of sex. It has to be vaginal intercourse.
Mm-hmm. Does that mean that lesbians can have like twice the marriage?
Let me be more specific.
They don't have a
penis needs to enter into a vagina. That's the only sexual act that will get you that one flesh unity between the two people. And he means one flesh. He means that literally.
Yeah.
He's not using that as just a cute metaphor. He really believes that vaginal intercourse actually makes the couple one organism. Or at least, I guess he says, function as one organism.
Right. The one flesh unity of spouses is possible because human males and females, by mating, unite organically. they form a single reproductive principle.
And then to illustrate this, he quotes Professor Germain Griez, who is also a natural law ethicist.
Though a male and a female are complete individuals with respect to other functions, for example, nutrition, sensation, and locomotion, with respect to reproduction, they are only potential parts of a mated pair, which is the complete organism capable of reproducing sexually.
Okay, so now you see why vaginal sex is so important to his framework, because he really takes this seriously. They are really becoming one organism. First, I want to make some important clarifications about what exactly he means here so we don't get confused. Yeah. In order to have the one flesh unity, the sex doesn't need to result in pregnancy. As his cute expression in the New York Times article says, people who practice baseball can be teammates without victories on the field.
Cute.
More surprising to me is that producing offspring doesn't even need to be the motivation for sex. And even further, he says it really shouldn't be. Sex is for the good, again, of spousal unity. That's it. Children are just kind of this happy byproduct, or as he says, it's a gift that results from this one flesh unity. To achieve that one flesh unity, the sex doesn't need to be reproductive. In fact, it just needs to be reproductive in type, he says.
Has to be the kind of sex that theoretically can produce offspring.
That's right. And so, of course, in his mind then, not all sexual acts are really marital acts if they are not reproductive in type. So masturbation is out the window. That's not going to help you. Anal sex, oral sex, these can't unite people organically to create that single reproductive principle. Mm-hmm. And because they don't, people, and this is a really weird point, I think.
Yeah.
People don't, because they are not aimed at achieving that marital unity, people don't seek them out for the sake of marital unity. They have more selfish motives like physical pleasure in mind. And I just think it's silly because I don't see how those things could possibly be mutually exclusive. But
yeah, right.
We'll get back to that. To quote George again.
Where one flesh unity cannot, or cannot rightly, be sought, sexual activity necessarily involves the instrumentalization of the bodies of those participating in such activity to extrinsic ends. Because in marital acts, sex is not instrumentalized. Such acts are free of the alienating and disintegrating qualities that have made wise and thoughtful people, from Plato to Augustine, and from biblical writers to Kant, treat sexual immorality as a matter of the utmost seriousness.
Okay, so in anal or oral sex, you're using the body as a tool. You're using the other person's body as a tool, essentially, just to get what you want, pleasure. And to him, that's dehumanizing the other person. It's even dehumanizing.
When it's at its best, yeah.
It's even dehumanizing yourself. It's basically treating them as a means to some sort of end. Mm-hmm. But luckily, if the penis actually goes into the vagina, you're taking part of something greater. Two bodies are becoming one. And so there's another goal in mind, marital unity. So
right.
The conclusion that follows from all of this is that technically gay marriage is not really wrong. It's not even possible.
It doesn't exist.
Their parts just simply won't allow them to experience the pure biological unity that heterosexuals can. Mm. And another conclusion, too, is that foreplay is okay if it facilitates the penis entering into the vagina. All other sexual acts are in some sense ethically wrong to him, though I'm very happy that he clarified for us that doggy style is still okay.
Yeah.
As long as it's going into the vagina. Okay.
Luke is just shaking his head.
I've been containing myself.
Yeah.
As we've been patiently laying out the argument.
Uh-huh.
All right. So I think everybody who's listening to this right now is going, why is this guy the most prominent intellectual?
That was my thought.
This just seems ridiculous on its face. But I do want to try to impress on people why it's important that we actually look at George's arguments. It's really hard to appreciate the brilliance of his argument and of his sophistry until you consider how you might try to object to it.
Sure.
Because he's actually, by starting off from this natural law foundation, it's very clever. He's heading off many of the objections of an empirical nature that you might bring up to him. You know, a typical thing we might try to do on the show is to show, well, okay, let's look at divorce. Right. You know, let's look at marriages. Let's compare the divorce rate between gays and heterosexuals, and show that, for example, the divorce rate is lower for gays than it is for conservative Christians. Well, so what? From George's account, that doesn't actually change the biological facts of the situation.
Right.
Or you could bring up parenting. Whatever measure you choose, and we've talked about this on the, the Speechless episode.
Right.
By whatever measure you choose, homosexual couples are just as good at parenting as heterosexual parents. Or in the case of lesbian couples we talked about, they might even be better. But this isn't going to make any difference to George. Maybe homosexuals can be good parents. Maybe they can have committed long-term relationships. Call it whatever you want. It's not marriage. Mm-hmm. That kind of unity can only take place between a man and a woman. And it doesn't just sidestep these empirical objections. It really tries to get around certain philosophical objections too. So what if you object to his definition? Say, I don't accept your natural law idea. I think love is what matters most. And shouldn't that be the basis of marriage? I think that's a very reasonable response that we typically would bring to an argument like this. Well, then he springs the relativism trap on you. Well, you know what? That's just your subjective opinion, Dave. You know?
Of course.
Oh, love, that's great flowery language, but, that's your secular faith. This definition that he's using, the natural law definition, rests on biological fact, the reality of nature, not mere convention. And if we're going to base our definition on what the current social tastes are, what's trendy at this time, and not on something objective like human nature, well, then what's going to stop us from legalizing polygamy, incest, bestiality? Really, where are we going to draw the line if it's all just our subjective social conventions? And then his masterstroke, in my opinion, then he's perfectly positioned to shift the burden of proof from himself onto his opponents.
It is necessary, therefore, for critics to argue that the apparent one-flesh unity that distinguishes marital intercourse from sodomitical and other non-marital acts is illusory, and thus that the apparent bodily communion of spouses in reproductive-type acts, which, according to the traditional view, forms the biological basis of their comprehensive marital relationship, is not really possible.
So now it's up to us to somehow prove that heterosexual intercourse doesn't become a mated pair, a complete organism capable of reproducing sexually.
I suppose if you define organism however you want, then...
Well, right. And I think we really can challenge this. I don't think it's all that difficult. But before we get into that, let's first consider some other objections. One of the very first things I was thinking when I was reading this is, what about infertile couples?
Absolutely.
Can you say that they're really married? I mean, if one of the partners is sterile or shooting blanks, what if the woman's had a hysterectomy?
Or she's postmenopausal.
Right.
Yeah.
They're not a biological unity capable of reproducing sexually. So
that's not a marriage.
Right.
Well, except it's the reproductive type act, right?
Right. He tries to sidestep it that way. I mean, he tries to answer this. Mm-hmm. He anticipates the argument, but he actually claims that sterility, and I'm not even sure why, but he claims this doesn't really matter.
But the plain fact is that the genitals of men and women are reproductive organs all of the time, even during periods of sterility. Acts that fulfill the behavioral conditions of procreation are reproductive in type, even when the non-behavioral conditions of procreation do not happen to obtain. Insofar as the point or object of sexual intercourse is marital union, the partners achieve the desired unity, become two in one flesh, precisely insofar as they mate, or, if you will, perform the type of act, the only type of act, upon which the gift of child may supervene.
I don't know about you, but I'm crying fumble.
Oh,
there.
big time.
That's where he screws it up.
The
biological unity of marriage is only possible through vaginal sex, because that's when they become a complete organism, but it doesn't actually matter if they're capable of reproducing. Basically what he's saying here is what matters is that the junk is lined up properly.
Right. His definition of marriage seems to be vaginal intercourse between a man and a woman.
Yeah, well, that's the physical aspect of it.
Well, yeah, but I mean that's it. It's inseparable from that part.
Right.
And if you want to define it that way, I guess you can't have gay marriage.
But yeah, it's ridiculous. He might have had some grounds if he's talking about, okay, well, they're capable of reproducing, but when he takes reproduction out of it, I mean, he completely. If you can have a couple that are sterile, but they're still one organism capable of that's like saying, okay, in the act of driving, the car and the driver become one unit.
Right.
But even if the engine won't start, or even if it doesn't even have an engine, just as long as you turn the steering wheels, operate the pedals, and go vroom, 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 you're still operating as one unit. It's ridiculous. It completely falls apart. Really, you don't even have to go that far. He really screwed things up as soon as he staked his one flesh unity idea on reproductive biology. He thought he was finding an objective basis, but as soon as he did that, he lost the argument. Because anybody who's going to take a closer look at human biology is going to have to think twice about using nature as a guide in this area. So now we turn to our expert on human sexuality here, at least on the academic end.
His argument is unusual in the sense that we usually have people complaining about evolution and secularism as saying that our evolutionary history somehow justifies this or that behavior. That is, we're the ones that say, well, since there appears to be violence in our evolutionary history, that doesn't make it so, you evolutionists. He's actually turned it around by using natural facts like the way a penis and a vagina go together to justify why here's the way that it looks biologically, so that justifies here's the way it should be, or that the only way it could be. But if you look at sexuality, I mean, it just doesn't line up with the facts about like evolutionary theory about why evolutionary theory says that different sexes exist, male and female, because there's an inherent competition involved, not unity. That if you look at the reproductive tracts of women, for example, they are often used to weed out and prevent conception, or at least not make it easy so that she can select the best sperm, for example. There's a whole area of sperm competition theory, not only with humans but with men, that why do chimpanzees have huge testes? Because they need to compete with other chimpanzees. Why do females, one of the theories about female orgasm is that it's designed to select or suck up specific quality male sperm. Why is the vagina so acidic to sperm killing them? Is because it's basically weeding out the weenies.
And the male sperm does this competition too, right? Like
amongst themselves.
Let's say a man and a woman are prevented from the ecstasy of biological union because
what a beautiful phrase.
Because he's going on a business trip or something. When he comes back and has sex with his wife, the volume of his ejaculate actually increases.
His sperm count, and animals have things like sperm plugs and blocker sperm where they try to fight out with another male's potential ejaculate. But even on now we're finding even on a chromosomal level, there's actually competition between males and females for dominance of which alleles become dominant for different traits.
Yeah. There's a little war going on in there.
There's behavioral evolution that talks about like with women when they're ovulating and they have a steady partner but who's not there, they behave or dress differently than when they either don't have a partner or when the partner's with her. Yeah. So there's all sorts of converging evidence that this one flesh unity idea is simply is not only odd, but it's actually the opposite. That in some ways there is an inherent competition between males and females. Not that we don't want to reproduce in a biological sense, but just that there's this idea of the monogamy standard of vaginal intercourse between a male and a female being that's the only thing that it exists for, is to make conception easy, is just wrong.
Yeah. That's this may be a little off the topic, but I was reading somewhere that even in pregnancy, this little genetic war between the sexes is still going on. So the on the Y chromosome, something's going on that's trying to get the fetus to draw more resources from the mother, which could potentially harm her.
If you're a male and you have a child that a female is carrying, it's to your interest that benefit the child, even if in some cases not the mother. That is, if you had to choose to, your genetics want that child to exist.
Right.
For a female, that's the opposite.
Yeah, and they've evolved
countermeasures.
They've evolved countermeasures to actually duke this out.
Yeah, and you can think that it's almost like a mathematical necessity that any male's chromosomes who promote fetus survival at all other expenses secondary are going to survive more than ones that say, oh, yeah, you want to abort my kid because you're not getting nutrition. Oh, go ahead and do that. I mean, it's there's an inherent conflict of interest in that. So that's one problem with his theory is that that doesn't fit up with that. And I think that's a more general thing is that the sophistry of his argument is apparent because it looks, like you said before, you mentioned it's almost designed to do an end run around any empirical objections.
Right. He even
denigrates in some of his essays empiricism itself. He calls it reductionistic and the merely factual, as opposed to the shining diamond of armchair type rationalism.
The merely factual.
The merely factual is a phrase. And so, like, when you start thinking of these things, like, what about infertility? What about this? What about that? That he will then say those are all instrumental aspects, not the the
intrinsic
means to the goal. So if you talk about like what's best for the child, we mentioned divorce, for example. However regrettable that in some situations, research shows that divorce is actually in high conflict relationships. It's better for the kids that their parents divorce.
I can speak to that personally. My wife and her ex-husband are both, and their children are better off. Because they got divorced. He
tries to actually throw things in there that you're not looking for, like, oh, empirical objections don't matter, but then he'll say, divorce is a negative thing, look at the rampant divorce. Right. You can see he's trying to have it both ways.
Yep.
He's trying to say divorce bad, marriage good, homosexual marriage bad, but any empirical objections, don't even try to make them against my argument.
Right, because he's created this philosophical foundation that he's going to work from. That's why originally with his argument, I was thinking, most people, when they try the standard objections, they're going to be forced to refute the meta-ethical foundations of natural law. And how many people are going to be even know how to approach that? And I guess that's why for this podcast, I decided, we really don't even need to go there. I mean, I do think there are some serious problems with natural law. It's not the form of ethics that I personally adopt for myself.
Right.
But I think an atheist or a naturalist could adopt some of those ideas. But the point is, we don't even need to go that far. We can go within his system and show that, this idea of somehow that this is the humans are forming a reproductive unity, functioning as one organism. That is, as he says, as he challenged us to show, that's illusory. That is.
It's arbitrary. Why is that the goal? So it's almost like he's saying philosophically, I've identified this bedrock. Here's this bedrock principle of one flesh, and that's the thing that it has to stand on. Why?
Yeah.
Right.
Why does marriage have to stand on that?
And if he's really serious about looking to human biology to find this foundation, well then, as you just pointed out, Luke, he'd be better off looking at reproduction as genetic warfare, basically. That's sexual competition for individual reproductive gains at every level.
Think about the implications of that, too, for things like marital happiness, women's rights, even child welfare. He's prepared to throw that baggage overboard for a idealized thing. So like we said, with divorce, with child welfare, or like a gay couple raising a kid, he's willing to then say, well, the child's welfare is not the primary thing. That's a secondary aspect of what marriage is for. Traditional, he's placing all his things on that. And
the holy act of getting the junk in one place is superior to all other ends.
It's a mistake, too, to say that, because the two parts fit together so perfectly, that's the way it should be, because there are other parts that fit together really well, too.
Well, that's why I thought this other quote that he added, where he said, he quoted this guy, John Finnis, who's another Catholic philosopher, and he goes, it would be more realistic to acknowledge that the whole process of copulation, and I should say he brought this up as a counterpoint to people who are saying, look, your argument excludes infertile couples from being married.
Right.
He brought this up as his counter-argument. It would be more realistic to acknowledge that the whole process of copulation, involving as it does the brains of the man and the woman, their nerves, blood, secretions, coordinated activity, is biological through and through. The organic unity, which is instantiated in the act of a reproductive kind, is not the unity of the penis and the vagina. It's the unity of the persons in the intentional, consensual act of sexual intercourse. My God, it's like I said fumble earlier. This is like he's passing the ball to the other team.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. So why does it matter if it's vaginal intercourse? If it's about all this multi-level working together, that's silly.
Yeah, I think that his argument against this is, we've been talking about the gay marriage thing, but he extends the same principle to other things like we mentioned stem cell research, even traditional, like traditional marriage where each sex has some sort of unique role by biology. He extends this view to things like, broad variety of social policies. So you can go and look up, if you look on the web, you can look up his essays on a variety of topics beyond gay marriage, but they all involve this notion of traditional values being justified philosophically through pure reason. And I think what's dangerous, what our listeners need to know, is this is not just dangerous for gay marriage or the stem cell research. It's dangerous on a level of society, because in some of his essays he's arguing that this trumps things like, for example, democracy. Democracy is not a primary value, he argues. It is not it is one of those instrumental values that's not good in and of itself. And so he's basically, like, on issues, he's urging Catholics to not go along with essentially a social consensus.
And even if we find his arguments silly, what people also need to realize, and why this Robert George guy is a very important figure to watch, is because natural law ethics does have a foothold in legal thinking.
Yeah, absolutely.
Princeton and Scalia. I'm sorry.
Well, and in specific individuals, yes, like Justice Scalia, take this guy's word very seriously. He is influencing what a lot of conservative judges, and who knows, maybe even liberal judges in this country are thinking.
Sure. And arguing that these views should have the force of law.
That's right.
Yes.
Most importantly, as we've tried to point out, people are going to be ill-prepared critiquing this with just the traditional counter-arguments. So going along that line, to kind of wrap this discussion up, I'm not very into natural law, but working from his framework, I'd like to submit that if human nature really does point to some sort of biologically based intrinsic good, I'd like to submit that it's not something as superficial as the junk lining up, but it's the bond that forms between individuals, not the genitalia that they happen to bring to the party. The sexual act can foster bonds in the brain.
Right.
The release of oxytocin following orgasm.
But you don't have to be married to do that.
Yeah, that people bond. That's not unique to that. It's a general trusting aspect of things. So, you could have the same effect by masturbating next to somebody else and talking with them or something.
Sure.
To use his own terms, I would just say marriage is an instrumental good. It's in service of the bond that's created between two individuals. He really does have his priorities and his values in the wrong place. I don't see how any ethical system can stand regarding marriage if it doesn't place the priority in the relationship.
Yeah, and his for those listeners out there too that come across people like this that make this argument, because like I said, I've been running into more and more people on boards and who argue from this, who look like they've been reading from this playbook, and it sounds very tough to argue against, because they say we're about rationalism, we're not scriptural, we're not basing on this. What you then have to say is it's armchair rationalism. It's Thomas Aquinas type philosophizing about angels on the head of opinion type rationalism. It's cut itself, and here's the thing that upsets me the most, it's cut itself free from empiricalism. Rationalism, pure rationalism, is not the same as empirical validation.
That's right.
We often mention those two things in one breath.
It has no external check.
You have to have an external check on whether your ideas mesh up with reality.
That's
and he has cut himself loose from that. If this is such a great idea, if one flesh unity is the ideal for marriage, it should then line up with empirical things like are the children happiest?
Right.
Are they are they the longest lasting things? For example, in Europe, their cohabitational relationships last longer than the marriages in the United States. If one flesh unity in marriage is a good thing. Why is that the case?
That's right.
He's insulating his theory from reality is basically what he's doing. And then having the audacity to call it natural law.
Listeners need to bone up on empirical objections to these arguments, and then when they're confronted with one of these types of Jesuitical thinkers, to then throw that at them and say, if your theory is in any way related to reality, prove it.
But I would add to that, though, I think this is also an example of why it's important to be familiar and conversant with philosophy. Because if you don't have an appreciation of his starting point, you're not going to know how to effectively articulate those empirical objections. And there was one other thing I wanted to say. I think the one flesh, that phrase, should also be kind of a tip to anybody what's actually going on here. Why does he call it one flesh? And that's obvious because it comes from the Bible. It comes from Genesis. This guy, he's making his arguments like a philosopher, but he's thinking like an apologist. Yeah. He's starting with his end conclusion.
And they always seem to line up magically with his biblical principles.
The Catholic stamp
he's
on
tailoring
this.
all of his starting assumptions to get him to that end conclusion that he wants.
And read his essays on things like a social policy. He'll say Catholics, you want to fight for poverty and social justice. Yeah, do that all you want, but these are not gospel issues. He even says that somewhere in there, it quotes him like in the New York Times piece as saying, we need to fight for the gospel issues of homosexuality and
which
marriage.
isn't
really?
in the gospel.
That's a gospel issue and not social justice, sir?
Yeah.
When you actually turn to like a religious magazine, what was the one you looked up, Luke? There was some religious periodical that he writes for. He completely...
Touchstone.
Yes, Touchstone. Thank you. When you read those, it becomes completely clear where he's coming from. His stuff on abortion that he wrote, he's actually comparing liberals to, he's calling them worshipers of the detestable god Molech.
And sex education education is mysticism and sophism. He's across the whole board. Sex education, non-traditional gender roles of egalitarian sex. Women are not safe from this guy. He's saying that that they have specific roles based on their biology.
Yeah. Well, he may claim that he's using a rational approach, but Catholicism is stamped all over his way of thinking.
It's almost like we mentioned Scalia before. It's almost like we can predict what decision he's going to make before he ever makes it.
Absolutely.
It makes a mockery of an independent, like a judge, just to know that somebody's going to take a certain position and then post hoc generate whatever rationale you need to get there.
Well, that New York Times article talked about all his connection. He's got Scalia's ear. He's got Newt Gingrich's ear. He's actually doing some of the most to bring together all these warring factions of Protestants and Catholics together to get behind these really reactionary policies.
Because it takes on this veneer of an intellectuality and an independence from the emotional aspects of religion. Mm-hmm. You can make your stand on a rational basis.
So I wouldn't be surprised if Robert P. George shows up again on the podcast sometime in the future.